Imagine being trapped in a dark room with no escape. Your mind is screaming for rest, but you can't sleep. No matter how hard you try, the exhaustion only makes it worse. Now, what if I told you there's a place where sleep was not just denied, but experimented on? A place where the human mind, pushed to its absolute limit, broke in ways that no one could have predicted. What happens when you take away sleep, the most basic human need? And what horrors might emerge when you push the limits of sanity and the body? In the 1940s, deep within the Soviet Union, a disturbing experiment was conducted. It was known as the Russian sleep experiment, a top-secret study that promised to change the world. A group of 5 test subjects, prisoners to be exact, were locked away in a sealed room. They were given a stimulant to prevent sleep and told they were part of a study to enhance mental endurance. But what began as a controlled experiment quickly spiraled into a grotesque nightmare. You see, the scientists never anticipated what would happen when the human mind was deprived of sleep for days, then weeks, then months. At first, everything seemed normal. The subjects complained about the lack of sleep, yes. But they didn't scream. They didn't fight. They simply waited. Their bodies began to show signs of stress. Pale skin, exhaustion, trembling hands. But still, they held on. For a time, it almost seemed like they were able to endure. But soon, the psychological effects began to take hold. Have you ever been so tired that your thoughts start to blur? That's what they felt at first. A dull fatigue that wouldn't leave, no matter how hard they tried. But then, things began to change, slowly, at first. One by one, the prisoners began to speak less. At first it was subtle. They murmured to themselves in hushed voices. They would rock back and forth, their movements jerky, as if something was crawling inside their minds. Their eyes became wide, bloodshot, and their conversations, they stopped making sense. They weren't just tired. They were unraveling. What happens when the mind begins to break? And then, something even stranger happened. On the 5th day, something horrifying took place. One subject, his face now gaunt and hollow, started to scream. Not in pain, but in terror. He couldn't stop. His eyes darted back and forth, as though he saw something in the room with him. Something no one else could see. The others tried to comfort him, but it was too late. He was gone. But what really broke the line between human and monster was what came next. As the days passed, the prisoners' behavior became more erratic. Some of them began to talk to themselves as if they were talking to someone else. Their murmurs were inaudible, but you could sense the madness creeping in. And then, the ultimate horror began to unfold. One by one, they began to mutilate themselves. A prisoner gouged out his own eyes, while another peeled his own skin away, layer by layer. Could you imagine the terror of losing control? The grotesque and unnatural images burned into the walls of your mind. things you can't even unsee. That's what they faced. They were no longer just victims of an experiment. They were prisoners of their own madness. But the true horror had only just begun. Because by the end of the experiment, something even more chilling happened. Something that no one could have predicted. Something that would leave you wondering, were they really human anymore? But before I tell you what happened next, let me ask you this. What would you do if you couldn't sleep? If your mind was trapped in an endless waking nightmare, and the line between reality and hallucination began to blur? How far would you go to escape? The final phase of the experiment unfolded in absolute chaos. The surviving prisoners had changed. Their minds, completely shattered, were no longer their own. They had become something else. Something that could no longer be called human. And when the scientists decided to end the experiment, they realized too late that they had made a grave mistake. Because the prisoners didn't want to escape. No. They were too far gone. Instead, they begged to stay awake. They begged for more. And in the end, the question remains, who was the real monster in the Russian sleep experiment? The prisoners who lost their minds, or the scientists who pushed them past the brink of sanity? The Russian sleep experiment is a terrifying reminder of what lies beneath the surface of the human mind, of how fragile our sanity is, and what might happen if that final thread is snapped. And now, you have to ask yourself, what's scarier? The unknown horrors of the mind, or the ones that stare back at you from within? Sleep tight. And never forget, some things are better left unknown.